Good morning y muy buenos dias, friends of the Museum of South Texas History, and all other friends as well who may be joining us from across the world. My name is Francisco Guajardo. I'm the CEO of the Museum of South Texas History. And we're having a museum plática today with a really interesting historical character and a noted photographer, a fellow by the name of Alan Pogue. Alan Pogue has so many connections to South Texas. He began to come down to the Rio Grande Valley sometime in the maybe early to mid 1970s as a photographer. Alan was, one of the main documenters of the United Farm Worker movement in the state of Texas. And then he also traversed the country, went into places like California and Florida and other places to be a photographer of people who were laboring, working the fields, and other people who were involved in that kind of industry and also the movimiento. So Alan resides in Central Texas and has for many years. And so he will be joining us shortly for this edition of Museum Pláticas. So stay with us, and I think we're going to have a really good conversation today with Alan Pogue. Welcome back to Museum Pláticas, Museum of South Texas History version of our own documentation process. And so, as some of you may know, some of you who have been following us, we do Museum Pláticas for a number of reasons. Number one, we want to be part of our purpose, our mission to preserve and present the history and legacy and culture and heritage of South Texas and northeastern Mexico. And so we are steadfast in that regard. The other part of this is that we are also pushing a little bit of the boundaries of what oral history is. And so we want to engage in an oral history such as we're going to do today with Alan But we want to do this in real time so that people can actually be witness to it and they can interact with us. So if somebody has a question, you can post a question through Facebook Live, because we are on through Facebook Live and also YouTube Live. But we also record it, and it will be immediately available for the world as soon as we finish this. So you can see it live, and then you can also go and interact with it after the fact. And so it is accessible oral history work so that the world can have access to the experiences of South Texas and northeastern Mexico. So Alan, welcome to the museum.
Well, I'm happy to be here and talk about all this.
Had you been to this museum before?
Yes, I believe I have. And I remember way back when it was Pan American, even being part of some programs. Oh, it would have been the late 70s before UT got involved directly.
So you would have come to the university, but maybe not the museum at the time?
Maybe not. Yeah, it would have been Pan American University at the time.
Right. Yeah, so the university is probably about maybe 2-3 more, maybe 4 or 5 blocks from here. And that organization, of course, has been there since the 1920s. This museum was founded in the mid-60s. Some local people came together, wrote up a charter, opened its doors in 1970 to the public. So we have, as this cultural organization that really pursues the purpose of preserving and presenting for 53 years now. So we've got that kind of history. Alan, I'm really interested in listening to your story here as a photographer. And so your story as a photographer, I think, takes a lot of different, dimensions. I mean, you have been a photographer who has been guided by this whole idea of justice, social justice, racial justice, economic justice, those kinds of imperatives for you. Where does that come from? Assuming that I'm right about that, where does that come from?
Well, I was an altar boy for 13 years, starting a cathedral school in Corpus Christi, and then St. Patrick's, and then University of St. Thomas in Houston. I was still doing it. And, I really took it to heart. I think the most important thing to me is the parable of the Good Samaritan. I mean, the Samaritans were the outcast people that looked down upon by the Hebrews. And so for a Samaritan to go out of his way to help an injured Hebrew, that was very unusual, and you wouldn't think it would happen. But this person saw beyond all cultural, ethnic, religious barriers and did what was important. He saw a fellow human being in need and did something about it directly, immediately. And so that carried over into the rest of my life. And when I was drafted in 1966 into the Army, they asked me what I wanted to do, and I said, well, I want to be a medic, because a medic will help people who are injured. And so the Army was very happy for me to be a medic. And I went to Fort Sam, Houston, and medic training. And then when I went to my first duty station, however, I would always go to the chapel to read. And I was reading theology. I was reading a book by Teilhard de Chardin, The Making of a Mind. His war letters when they called it a litter bearer, but it was like a combat medic in the First World War. And as it happened, the chaplain at that particular chapel was Roman Catholic, and he had taught a course in Chardin in the University of Montana. Captain Donald Shea is his name. And after a while, he kept seeing me there reading. He asked me if I'd like to be his assistant. And so I said, oh, yes, I'd love to be your assistant. And so then I started working in the chapel instead of being a medic. And he even had me teaching religion to soldiers who were going to become married to Catholic young women, and they wanted them to learn about the Catholic Church. And then he had me teaching remedial reading for adults who were going to take their GEDs in downtown Colorado Springs. So we were quite close, but he had volunteered to be a chaplain with the Special Forces. And he asked me if I would like to join him in that. And I said, I'd be happy to. And he joked, he said, well, you'll have to jump out of airplanes and eat worms. I'd have to take an abbreviated Special Forces training. And I said, okay, I'll jump out of planes and eat worms. And so he came back and said, but if you do that, you'll have to stay in the Army another 6 months to pay him back for this wonderful training. And I said, well, no, I really don't want to do that. And so then I stuck around Fort Carson, Colorado. But the chaplains I got after he left, who took over at the chapel, they weren't as interested in helping lower ranked soldiers as he had been. He said that he didn't care. He was going to have one term of service and he was just going to go back to being a parish priest, which didn't turn out to be true, but that's what he thought. So, but after having a series of chaplains who were sort of uninspiring to me, I volunteered to go to Vietnam as a chaplain's assistant. And I didn't know it at the time, but as soon as I got to Vietnam, other parts of the Army wanted to take me back into being a medic because they needed medics. But the chaplains corps won out, and I went to my first assignment. But the chaplain that I drew, he had been an orphan. He was an orphan. And he went into the Benedictine orphanage, Benedictine high school, Benedictine seminary. Now he was a Benedictine priest in Vietnam, surrounded by orphans. And he couldn't do anything but beg, borrow, and steal material for the orphanages. And he would get these big 2.5-ton trucks and go around collecting clothes and soap and medicine and everything and take him to the orphanage. But he was completely neglecting his duty as a chaplain to the soldiers. And while I could understand that, it became kind of a problem. And so I volunteered to go back into the medics as a combat medic. But my mother had given me this little plastic Instamatic camera, looked like a little plastic brick that you could put these flash cubes on top of. And I started taking pictures of everything, just my barracks and my friends.
But your mother gave you the camera because she wanted you to communicate with her.
Yes, she joked. She said, well, you'll never write a letter, so send me some photographs. And I had never thought anything about photography before. But now that she had this camera, she had given it to me, I started taking pictures. But when I got into the field, walking around with the infantry on the countryside around Chu Lai, Vietnam, I was even more interested in taking pictures of us and the Vietnamese and the countryside. And the helicopter pilots would take my film to the PX and have the film developed or slides developed and bring back either the prints or the slides. And I was getting immediate feedback. I mean, I'd give them the film and I'd have the result in maybe 2 or 3 days. And so I could see what was working and what wasn't working. And of course, I couldn't use flash cubes in Vietnam and probably get shot doing that. So I realized I needed
As you tell the story, I'm looking for the photograph
of me.
Of you in Vietnam. And so, Tony, I don't know if you can zoom in on this to see. This is Alan, 1967, right there.
And I treated the Vietnamese people as often as I could. Every time we would make camp, the company commander would give me a squad of riflemen to be my bodyguards. And I would go, and it really didn't matter where I went. I would just go set up in an open space and Vietnamese people who were sick or injured somehow would just show up magically out of the, I don't want to say jungle because it was more like the hill country in Texas. Tall grass, trees, rocky terrain. And they'd show up and, like some child would have a ear problem. Or one time a child had been injured in the leg by a metal fragment from a bomb that had been dropped. Or the worst case, and the one that was a turning point for me, was this woman, and you have to remember I'm 20 years old, maybe 21, and she looked to be in her 30s, and she lifted up her blouse, and her whole side, it was just raw meat. She had been hit by napalm. And this is a horrible thing, and I knew what she needed would be to be airlifted to San Antonio because they have a great burn center there. But I had no authority to be having anyone airlifted out of Vietnam. But I knew that there was a type of medicated gauze. And so I put in an order for that. And it's these big, about a foot square sheets of antibacterial gauze. And I cleaned her body off as well as I could and papered her with this gauze and gave her many packages of it so that she could replace it. But I knew that she needed intravenous antibiotics for something that large, but I just couldn't make that happen.
Alan, I want to take us back to a reference you made about you being an altar boy. Did I hear you correctly that you said you were an altar boy for 13 years? How does one become an altar boy for 13 years?
Well, I'm in the 6th grade.
You're in the 6th grade, okay.
At the cathedral school. And I think it was the 6th grade, if not the 5th. And this is back in the time when it was all in Latin, so I had to learn all this Latin.
In Corpus Christi?
In Corpus Christi.
What church?
The cathedral church on the bluff, the big cathedral.
You grew up in Corpus Christi?
Yes.
Your parents were from there?
My mother was from Corpus Christi. My Irish ancestors came to the coast of Texas in 1840, and there was no Corpus Christi. It was the Corpus Christi Bay, and it was McKinney's trading post. And they were all farmers, and so they all started farming and ranching, had a dairy, and some of them were raised sheep out in Comstock, Texas. And my mother's mother was a widow, and she ran the ranch, the farm, and the dairy. She was a tough woman, and I got some funny stories about her. But
so there's we have the letters of a fellow named William Henry Chapman.
Yes, Chapman Ranch.
Well, that's another Chapman because there was actually a couple of Chapmans, but during the Mexican War. So there was a Chapman guy who wrote letters to his wife in Wisconsin, in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So we have maybe about 15 of those letters. But his namesake, another guy named Chapman, became the quartermaster of Brownsville and Matamoros and would then go to Corpus Christi to lay out basically the infrastructure for Corpus Christi right after the Mexican War. So the way you describe the chronology is actually spot on. When your family would have come in 1840, there was no Corpus Christi. This would have happened after the war, after the 1840s, probably early 1850s.
Mm-hmm.
So that was was it on the Pogue side, or was it
Well, that was the Kellys.
The Kellys.
And the McBrides, the McDonoughs, the Dunns. These are all, the whole clan must have come over. And so I had all of these. I knew out to my 5th cousins. My 5th cousin, Mike Gallagher, was the youngest foreman ever on the King Ranch, right after World War I. And the Laurellis section. And so at 6 years old, I was going to roundups twice a year I called him my Uncle Mike, but he was my 5th cousin.
Twice a year?
Twice a year.
Roundups. So you would go and stay in a little cabin or maybe outside?
Well, yes, I'd be outside. We'd be at this picnic table, and there'd be a side of beef hanging from a mesquite tree. And so I by observation, I learned that all of the cowboys were Mexican. and all of the managers and overseers were Anglo. And some of them were from Australia. I mean, the King Ranch was international, and they had land in Argentina and in Cuba, as well as Australia. So I got really into the whole culture.
So I'm sensing a few sources here of inspiration, motivation, guideposts in life. So one was your Catholic upbringing, which you took very seriously, it seems. I mean, an altar boy for a number of years means some kind of commitment. I'm sensing here that kind of an appreciation for los trabajadores out in the field, you know, en el campo, los vaqueros, mexicanos, that sort of thing, because of your kind of exposure to the workers at the King Ranch. I mean, there's some other things here that I'm sensing that become part of what shapes the value system of Alan Pogue, right? You graduated from high school, what, in 1960?
65.
Which high school?
Ray High in Corpus.
Ray High School. Incidentally, I want to say that Bambi Cardenas is saying hello to you.
Oh, hi.
She says that this is wonderfully fascinating. She says, have been grateful for Alan for years.
Well, thanks, Bambi.
So I think she lives up where you live now. I think she lives in Austin. Yeah, you know, she retired as a university president here.
Wow.
So you probably have some stories about her. Let's get back to you here. You graduate 65. You are drafted.
I was drafted. Yes, I was in San Francisco. I had left with some of my buddies on a quest to find the City Lights bookstore and talk to Allen Ginsberg and all of those people. So
Did you find them?
No, they were all doing mushrooms in Mexico, so I wouldn't get to speak with them. But I love City Lights bookstore, and I always go there whenever I'm in San Francisco. I did get to meet Ginsberg many times and photograph William Burroughs intensely.
You know the story of Burroughs being here in the Valley.
Only I knew that he was in South Texas, but I don't really know any detail.
Yeah, he owned like some farmland out here by, I don't know, like Rogers Road or somewhere here. This great literary character in American literature was here.
Yes, and he was so mild-mannered. He to me, he was like an English professor at a small northeastern college.
How about that?
He was, you know, because his work, his literature is so wild and intense. But he was.
I asked you the question as we walked in, and so this Plática is not linear, as you can tell, but neither you nor I are linear either.
Yes. So, but I guess back. I want a little bit more about the King Ranch.
Yes, please.
You know, I was going there twice a year, every year, until my Uncle Mike died when I was 13, and
this is your Uncle Mike and his
Gallagher.
Mike Gallagher,
Who was my fifth cousin, who was the foreman on the Lorella section of the King Ranch, and he was a tough guy. I remember he had a very high-quality Italian switchblade that he'd pop open and trim his fingernails, and then he'd finish it off with a triangular file because his fingernails were so tough. I mean, in the First World War, his job was to run the mule teams that pulled the cannons. I mean, you got to be some tough character to do that kind of work. But on the King Ranch, it was all of the Mexican cowboys who did the actual work, who rode the horses, who roped the cows and branded them and gave them their inoculations and just did everything. And I knew this is very hard work and rough work, and you can get injured quickly. And he would do things like put me on top of a quarter horse and I'm 8 years old, and this horse is massive, and it would be like putting you in a Lamborghini and say, go for a ride. Well, of course, I couldn't go for a ride on this magnificent beast, but I could feel it humming with energy. It was scary. And he would let me rope a calf. Well, of course, the calf didn't want to be roped, and it's like taking off, and my hands were being burned by the rope, running through my hands. I couldn't hold on to it. And but a funny lesson was, we sat down for lunch, and of course the cowboys would have a big pot of pinto beans, and then they'd have a bowl of chili pintines, these really tiny little peppers, hotter than a firecracker. There were red ones and yellow ones. And they would take a few and sprinkle them on their pinto beans and mash them up and eat them. So I thought, okay, that's what you do. So I sprinkled a few of those things on my pinto beans and mashed them up. And then the flame came out of my mouth. And everybody started laughing. And they gave me a bowl of milk, freshly squeezed from a cow, to drink and put the fire out. Oh, man, I never did that again. But
were they eating that?
Oh, they were eating that and showing no effect at all. I had no idea what was coming at me.
And how old were you?
I was only like 8. And, oh, that was tough.
That's a crazy story.
Oh, man, but so I learned a lot by observation. And so later on, I figured out how to make that observation concrete in a photograph.
So this idea of photography for you, was it your mother giving you a camera when you went off to Vietnam and saying, look, I know you're not going to write letters, but send me pictures? Or did your mother give you that camera because your mother had seen something in you as kind of an artist, a photographer, a visual person?
My mother was always encouraging me, and she had me take music lessons, piano lessons, guitar lessons. She even had me take Russian. And
Russian during the Cold War?
Yes, she said she wanted someone in the family to be able to speak it just in case they took over. So there was a Russian immigrant lady came by and would give me Russian lessons a couple of times a week. And I remember very little of it. But, it was interesting. And if I was interested in rockets in outer space, well, she took me to the library in Corpus, and she would pay me to read books. If I'd read a hardback book, she'd give me $1. And so after a while, I had a good deal of money in my bank account because I like to read. And she would always come home with so many books, it was hard to carry them. And I would come home with 1 or 2.
What was your mother's name?
Mary Catherine Quinn. Well, my grandmother was Kelly, and she married a Quinn, I think. Let's see. So they called her Kay, my mother.
What did your mother do for a living?
Well, she was a homemaker, and a mother, but she didn't have any job outside of the house.
What was your father's name?
Tom Pogue, and he was a lawyer. He grew up in Smithville, Texas. His father drove a train for the Katy and the Southern Pacific. So he said it was very important because he had a good job during the Depression. And my father got a scholarship to Rice. He got a BA in English literature. He said he realized you can't make any money with a BA in English literature, so he went to UT and got a law degree. And he graduated from law school in the middle of World War II. And so as soon as he got his degree, he was drafted, and the Army didn't know quite what to do with him. He said, well, you're a big guy. He was 6'2", and you got a law degree. We want you to be a counterintelligence agent. And so he became a counterintelligence agent. So his job was, they sent him to Corpus to investigate plane crashes. And because they had a huge naval base in Corpus Christi. And if a plane crashed, he would try to see if there's any sabotage. He said there was never any sabotage. It was always because they didn't filter the gasoline and clogged up the carburetor. Then the plane would fall out of the sky. But as a child, I read his manuals, how to investigate a homicide, how to steam open envelopes, how to tap people's phones. And he said he was a big, handsome guy, and he was walking around in a suit, and people would ask him why he wasn't in the Army all the time, and he could never tell them what his job was. And so that was an interesting part of my childhood.
Your father's influence on you, given that Your father was a lawyer. What kind of lawyer did he become?
He was a general practitioner. He said if he had it all to do over again, he'd be a corporate lawyer, so he'd have regular hours. But as a general practitioner lawyer, it's like being a general practitioner doctor. People are calling you night and day. But one of the formative things that happened was this child, and I think it was a Mexican child, got a Coca-Cola, and when he went to open it, it exploded, and a piece of the Coke bottle went into his eye. And somehow my father represented him in court and won a big amount of money from Coca-Cola. And afterwards, they put my father on retainer so he couldn't sue them again.
Coca-Cola and Corpus Christi put your father on retainer.
So that he would be in
Yes.
a business relationship with them, and he couldn't sue them. But the next thing was even bigger. There was a small African-American community in Corpus Christi, and they had their own whole section of town near what's the big harbor bridge now, with their own movie theaters and restaurants and dance halls and bars and everything. And there was this black police officer, and it was his beat. But the problem was he was honest. He wouldn't take any money. And so he wouldn't let people run illegal operations. And so some of the people in sort of organized crime wanted to get rid of him and set him up to have a confrontation. And in this confrontation, he had to defend himself and shoot somebody. And my father was appointed to be his defense attorney and got him off. He was not guilty by reason of, self-defense. But that wasn't what some people wanted. But the officer saw the handwriting on the wall. If he tried to be an honest cop in the black community, his life expectancy was short. So he opened up a barbecue stand. So every week, my father would take me to the barbecue stand to buy barbecue from this man. And every Christmas, he and his family came to our house and gave my father a present for basically having saved his life from this false charge. And
That's quite a story. What was the man's name?
I don't remember. I remember I went with my sister many years later to visit their home because my father was no longer alive, so we weren't going back and forth anymore. But that made a big impression on me and also got me into the black community in a way that I would never have any access otherwise.
When your father defended this man, how old were you?
Oh, golly, I must have been very small because I was never in the courtroom.
Right, but the fact that you were so young and this was happening in your family history with your father, and then this kind of relationship with a family and maybe even a community was formative for you.
Oh, yes. Actually going to sit down in people's homes in the black neighborhood, that would never have happened otherwise for me. And
Well,
there were other parts to it. I remember I used to go to the law library and I would hear other lawyers saying that they were moving into some gated community in south part of Corpus Christi so that their children wouldn't have to go to school with the Mexicans. And I was thinking to myself, I just walked in from the cathedral school, which was mostly Mexican-American children. And I thought, well, what's wrong with going to school with Mexicans? I do it every day. It's not hurting me at all. And then another time, some lawyer friends of my father's came to the home, and they were discussing interracial marriage. And everyone in the room was against it except my father. He said he couldn't see any problem, if a black man or a white woman or vice versa wanted to get married. What's wrong with that? It's nothing to me. And it almost like the silence was deafening because no one else in the room agreed with him. But that was a lesson to me. He was willing to say what he really thought when he knew no one else in the room would agree with him.
Well, I mean, he would have also been counter because I'm guessing that growing up in Smithville and going to Rice and then going to UT Law in the 1930s and 40s would have shaped you not to be about that kind of sensibility. Or could that be wrong as an assessment?
Well, when you look at the University of Texas and Heman Sweat and what it took to get black people into the law school, it was hard. I mean, it was just like the rest of the South during the Brown versus the, Board of Education and the integration of schools. It was big fights, and they had to send in the National Guard so that this little black child could go to elementary school. It was hard. And into the 60s, I remember my wife, Mary Birdsong, was the first white woman into the Alpha Kappa Alpha black sorority, and was living in the black sorority house, and her parents disowned her. And this was a tough time. And for him to say that, it was completely unusual and difficult.
Yeah, because Heman Sweat doesn't happen until the 50s. So
50.
when your father was in law
Rice,
school
yeah.
and at Rice, it would have been almost exclusively white
Yes.
and probably mostly male.
Yes.
Hmm.
And
So that's an interesting set of circumstances that would have shaped any child.
yes,
Yeah. Huh. So your siblings.
Oh,
How many siblings did you have?
well,
Or do you have?
my only living sibling is my sister, who's 3 years older, and she went to Our Lady of the Lake in San Antonio as a boarding student, really from the 3rd grade on through her master's in English. And I had a younger brother, but he died when he was 5. It was very sad. He had cerebral palsy and finally died of pneumonia. So that was my only other.
So this is what we're going to do, Alan. We're going to take a little break. And when we come back, I'd like to get into this conversation of post-war for you. When you come back from Vietnam and how your photography would just take off after that. Okay, so when we come back, we will re-engage in this Plática with Alan. Some fascinating stuff that Alan Pogue is sharing here about his life story. So be back in a minute. Welcome back, friends, to Museum Pláticas. Francisco Guajardo here with our guest, Alan Pogue. Alan, there's some photographs that you took that I saw in Witness for Justice of the anti-war movement.
Yes.
And so now, I just want to remind ourselves here that this is Alan Pogue, who was a veteran of the war, an Army medic. Then you come back from Vietnam, and you come back to this, Alan. So Tony, if you can just kind of get a photograph of this. You took this photograph.
Yes, 1974. It was one of the largest anti-police brutality demonstration and marches ever in Austin. It was a huge event.
So this one is on police brutality. You took this photograph here, Tony, the one on this side.
And at the University of Texas, there was a lot of anti-war activity. And I had joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And the next photograph over is of a coffee house that was run by former soldiers. So it was both Vietnam veterans and soldiers at Fort Hood who might go to Vietnam, and they had a coffee house where people could come and talk about it and tell stories. And
so, part of the discourse, the national discourse, both at the time but even now, I mean, this continues to be, I think, a deeply wounded issue.
yes,
You coming back from Vietnam and the American public, a good section of it, against you. Now, a good part of the American public may have been supportive, but the demonstrations.
yes.
And so you come back, and how do you see this? And then how is it that you then almost immediately transition to, this movement of veterans against the war?
Yes, and it really started in Vietnam. My friends in the Army in combat, we shared this view that the war was not right. It wasn't really helpful to the Vietnamese, and it was very hurtful to the Vietnamese. And so there was this huge contradiction between being told we were coming here to help democracy and help the Vietnamese people. But, the Vietnamese people, for the most part, would have been even happier if we'd just gotten up and left them alone to deal with their own problems. I spoke with a Vietnamese Catholic priest who explained it to me. We're sitting on a pile of rubble somewhere in Vietnam, and he was saying that really most Vietnamese are not Christians and they're not Buddhists, they're animists. They believe in the spirit of the forest and the spirit of the river and the sacredness of their place, the land where they're living and working and have been growing rice in particular for generations. And it's being bombed. We're dropping Agent Orange defoliants on it. And if anybody's seen a cotton field, they know you come and spray the cotton field, and in another day, all the plants are dead so that you can pick the cotton. Well, if you do that to a countryside, you're destroying the livelihood of people. And this is their sacred home. And so they can't be happy that you're there doing this. And this is in addition to people being wounded and other things. So we individually, at least some of us, felt morally wounded because we're not here being the good guy. We're here being the bad guy. And so that contributed to a lot of sadness on top of just the day-to-day difficulty of walking around in 120-degree weather with a lot of weight on you and being shot at every day, and my friends were being killed. And so we were against it. one of my best friends, Bruce Anello, Sergeant Bruce Anello, kept a diary. And when he was killed in a battle that lasted for 3 days, at that moment I was in Japan looking for a Nikon camera to buy, which I did. But I came back, and everybody in my company looked like they'd aged 20 years. All these tiny cracks in their faces, from worry and stress. And half of my company was either killed or wounded. But the medic that replaced me was not injured, so I felt a little bit better. But my best friend had been killed, and the North Vietnamese had gotten his diary in his backpack and later gave it to a peace delegation, and they took it back to the United States, and Win magazine published it as an issue. His diary was a complete issue. And so you can go to the internet and look up Bruce Anello, Anello, and his diary will be right there. You can print it out. And he talks about the stress of being an infantryman and being shot at every day, and how it slowly destroys your mind, and it makes you anxious and angry. And so I was glad to receive a copy of Win magazine and see my old friend.
Where was Bruce from?
He was from California, a very poor family. His family was so poor that he was put into a home, like an orphanage, and he went to a military school. But he was really a surfer boy, blonde surfer boy from California who had been a virtual orphan, although he had a very poor family. And he was full of vitality, and it got him into trouble all the time. And so he'd be constantly being busted, lowered in rank. But as soon as there was any military confrontation, he was a natural leader of small group combat. And so he would immediately be back in a leadership position, and they give him his sergeant stripes back. And this went on all the time. It was just hilarious.
When you and I walked into the museum this morning and we passed by an exhibit on Freddy Gonzalez.
Yes.
I told you the story of how Freddie's mother donated over 150 letters to the museum that Freddie wrote to her during his 2 tours of duty. And I think I asked you about your familiarity with Freddie's story, and you immediately said it's a very common story. And
well, the story that I know, which is very little, but it's the one about the soldier who's injured in combat but refuses to leave. I knew a medic. His last name was Silva. I don't remember his first name. But he was wounded, and so he was able to patch himself up since he was a medic, but he refused to be medevaced out because he could still keep helping others. And this is the poignant center of the controversy, is that so you're a soldier and you have your fellow soldiers and you're bonded with them because your life depends on them, their life depends on you, and you're in this horrible situation where you're under attack all the time, which keeps reinforcing that bond. And so you're desperate to justify this, that there was something essentially good about it. And what is essentially good about it is people caring for each other under situations of horrible stress. And so that's what many people carry with them. But they're not going to go back and read the history of the whole conflict and how the Vietnam War was really French colonialism, which the United States was paying for to a large extent. And then when the French wanted out, then the United States just took over from the French running the country. And it was not for the democracy of Vietnam. They were running the country to control it. And so this continued the conflict over and over. And if Vietnam had been given its freedom, we wouldn't be there fighting. But not everybody's going to go to the library, as I did, and spend a month researching the war. I went to the Corpus Christi Library. I had been a varsity debater at Ray High School. And I got my little 3x5 cards, and I went to the Index of Periodical Literature, and I looked up every reference I could find to the war in Indochina. And what I got from Time and Newsweek and Current Affairs Quarterly and Foreign Affairs Quarterly was a tiny stack of little 3x5 cards. And I looked at this pitiful stack, and I thought, well, even if you wanted to know, there wasn't enough good information given to the public that you could come to a decision as a debater. Because as a debater, you have to go at the subject with a neutral mind, and you have to make a case for it and against it. Equal, because when you go to a competition debate, it's going to be a flip of the coin, and you immediately have to take the affirmative or the negative. It doesn't matter what you really think. You have to be able to make the argument. It's like being a defense attorney or a prosecutor. You're trying to make your argument. And sadly, the absolute truth of it doesn't matter so much. What matters is, can you make a good argument? Well, I couldn't. And I was shocked to see that I couldn't make a good argument out of the information that was available. I had to read history books and biographies of the main players in order to figure out what was really going on. What led up to Alan Pogue being in Vietnam? What were the forces at work behind the scenes to most people? You know, then you find that people like Lyndon Johnson were in Vietnam way back when the French were still running it. That the situation was known to people. You know, a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, we didn't know. Well, if you're in the Congress or the Senate, you know what's going on in the deep background and the forces that are involved in making the situation happen. But this is all different from being a human being in a plane crash. And all of a sudden, the survivors of the plane crash on the side of a mountain somewhere have to figure out how to keep each other alive. And that's kind of the analogy I would draw for somebody in the infantry in a war. You didn't pick your side. Your country picked a side, and somebody either talked you into or made you be there. And so you have to deal with it. You just have to deal with it. And so you have all these experiences and your friends and you're suffering, and you don't want somebody saying that you are wrong, you know, or anything, you know, that it's your fault and all of that. And so I can see how people wouldn't like it as me, as a veteran of the war, being against it at a time when the actual war was still going on. But I'm looking for the moral purpose. What's the justification for all this? And so history and all of these other forces are vitally important.
And right about this time, I mean, I'm guessing this is probably 66, 67, maybe when you're going to the library. I mean, the chronicle on Ho Chi Minh was already out there, so you read about Ho Chi Minh. The debate on the Gulf of Tonkin was probably very prominent at the time, so you knew about that, and you knew about the politics of it. So it would have been very difficult for you as a kind of a moral dilemma. But then you were drafted.
I was drafted, and you know, I volunteered to go to Vietnam as a chaplain's assistant. You know, I had no idea that these other things were going to happen, and I'd wind up as a combat medic.
Had no idea. So, Alan, what happened to the camera, the Nikon camera?
I still have it, Nikon F, And I bought 3 lenses, a camera bag, and a flash for $214 at the Naval Exchange.
In Japan.
In Japan, in Tokyo.
How did you get out there? Did you ask for like a 1-week leave or what?
Well, it was common in Vietnam is after you've been there for a few months, you'd have what they call rest and relaxation, R&R, or rest and recuperation, whatever it was. And I asked to go to Hong Kong because that's where all the cameras were, I thought. But one day, another medic got out of a helicopter and said, your orders are in for you to go to R&R in Tokyo. Well, I wasn't going to say no. I'm getting on the helicopter. So I got on the helicopter and then on a jet to Tokyo. And in my mind, my biggest mission was to get a Nikon F because that was the best camera for photojournalism at the moment. And
well, now you were not a photojournalist when you were in Vietnam, and yet you actually became engaged as a photojournalist, weren't you?
Well, in Vietnam itself, I just continued to take pictures all the time. I became fascinated with photography in itself. You know, how do you take pictures under certain lighting conditions? And you know,
say more about that. Talk about that. Talk about how you would have had large chunks of time to be able to do this, and then how you played around with it.
Well, the one thing about war is you're not fighting every minute of every day. There's a lot of boredom. You know, we would walk from one place to another and make camp, and I was the medic with the command group. So I was with the captain and the first sergeant and the mortar crew, and we'd make camp, and we'd have a perimeter, and then squads of riflemen would go out and do whatever they were supposed to do. But meanwhile, I would just be there, sitting there. And I did a lot of reading. I have relatives that would send me books. I was reading Thomas Merton and more Teilhard de Chardin. And I read, The Confessions of St. Augustine in a B-52 crater. When it hits the ground and it just scoops out a lot of soil, and I dug a hole into the side of it and made that my office. And I put my helmet on top as, you know, here's the medic. And I was in there reading the Confessions of St. Augustine. But the photography, because I was getting my film back in a couple of days with my medical supplies, I was able to look at my pictures and see, well, what worked? You know, and it depends. I mean, where are you in relation to the sun? Is the sun behind me? Is it beside me? Is it in front of me? Am I photographing into the sun? Well, that's never going to work. So you have to pick your angle. And if it's at night, how little light can I take pictures with this camera without a flash? You know, what's the limit of the lower limit? So getting the upper limit, you know, you can't take pictures into the sun. You want the sun over your shoulder or to the side a bit. You have to watch your angle really closely. Where are the shadows falling across people's faces? And then what's going to happen in the shadows? Is there going to be any detail in the shadow of the face? Under bright light? Probably not. And so I was learning all these things, and I was thinking, well, I've got to have a better camera so I can control the aperture. It's like, how much depth of focus are you going to get? Well, with this little plastic camera, it's probably f8, which is a smaller aperture. It's not too bad. And the shutter speed on that camera is probably fixed at maybe 1/25 of a second. So with that combination, you can't get in a very low light level. But if you have a camera where you can set the shutter speed and the aperture, you can get away with taking pictures in very little light. And I was interested in that. So, but really, I wasn't going to subject my Nikon F camera and lenses to monsoons or anything, or to be hurt. So I continued to use my little plastic Instamatic where if it got hurt or destroyed, well, I could get another one for $5.
And where was the Nikon?
The Nikon was probably left in the battalion rear station in a locker. So that when I got back to the United States, though, I immediately had to learn how to use it. And there weren't classes the way there are now. So I got a big, thick book by Albert Fininger, The Complete Photographer. And he used so much jargon, I couldn't understand what it was. So I got a $2 book from Kodak on what is an aperture, what is the shutter speed, how do you develop black and white film. And then I went over to 6 Points in Corpus Christi to a camera store, and I'd be badgering the people that worked there all the time to tell me things and learn how to develop film. But Sister Adrienne Clare, who had been the principal at St. Patrick's, she was now the principal of the all-girls school in Corpus Christi. And the nun who took all the pictures for the high school had retired, and she had a complete darkroom adjacent to the biology department. So Sister Adrienne Clare said, "It's yours. Here's the key. Just take a few pictures for our annual, and you've got the run of the place." Well, it was beautiful. It was all stainless steel and ceramic, and it had safe lights built into the ceiling and a great big enlarger. All the film and the paper was dead. It was all too old. So I went to the camera store and replenished the supplies part of it, and I'd be in there for 12 hours a day, learning how to develop film, learning which developers work better than others, and making prints.
And you were 24, 25 years old?
Maybe 22, I think. I'd have to work it out.
Okay.
But so Sister Adrienne Clare, I kept up with her, and she came to the Valley, and she was in Brownsville running the high school there, and she was big friends with Bishop Fitzpatrick. And so every time I come to the Valley, I would go visit Sister Adrienne Clare, and that would mean I'd be hanging out with Bishop Fitzpatrick.
Now, is this so? This is actually a nice segue that you present for us, because Bishop Fitzpatrick and presumably Sister Adrienne Clare would have both been social justice members of the cloth. Beyond
yes.
just what the church did.
Oh, yes. Well, I know that Bishop Fitzpatrick helped found the first NPR-affiliated radio station in the Valley, I think. And, yeah, they were very involved in the community.
Yeah, and also Valley Interfaith, and he was involved with the farm workers. What?
Oh, yes, and then the Casa Oscar Romero for immigrants to stay in and be protected.
So, Alan, what was your first foray into the Valley? I'm not going to say South Texas, because you're a South Texan. You grew up in Corpus Christi. So your story around Corpus Christi is actually very much part of the Museum of South Texas History purpose, to capture stories of South Texas, and you're squarely within that. But the Valley is a whole other kind of world. Your first foray into the Valley.
Well, it's, I think, the most significant foray, because yes, I was coming to the Valley, and I'd go see Sister Adrienne Clare, but that wouldn't get me out into the wider community necessarily. It was 1975, and that was when the farm workers who were picketing to be paid more for each bushel of cantaloupes they picked were shot at by the field manager. Got up in the pickup truck, and fortunately he was probably using bird shot, and he wasn't too close, so no one was killed. But just the idea, you're shooting at somebody with a shotgun, you can put their eye out easily. You can hurt them badly if you get, very close. And he wasn't arrested. He never spent a night in jail, never had to defend himself in court. This was so outrageous. And what it reminded me of is the treatment of the Vietnamese peasant farmers in Vietnam. And to me, it was a perfect match. And I didn't like it there. I didn't like it here. We shouldn't be doing this. This is not, this is horrible. And so,
And so, how would you have found out about that experience? Did you read about it? You saw it on the news, or Sister Claire told you about it?
well, I guess what I sort of left out here is after I learned how to develop film and make prints, I came to Austin to UT, and I got a room in the University Y. At the time was a 3-story building with a basement, and the underground press, the Rag newspaper.
Pam, I think you have a photograph of the University Y there somewhere that Alan would have taken, but there's a march right in front of the University Y.
Oh yes, and the farm workers were coming in 1979.
79, yes.
It's a mule shoe to Austin march, and it was raining, and they were walking down the street, and I really liked it. They were going to pass where the University Y was, so I positioned myself to get a picture of the building because it had banners and mentioned different subjects, and then there's all the farm workers. Because I lived in my darkroom, I was a penniless student, and I had the GI Bill.
So you went to UT as a student of
I was studying
photography?
philosophy.
Philosophy?
Yeah, my major was philosophy, and I knew of Russell Lee, who was the first fine arts photography professor, but there was a 3-year waiting list to get into his class.
Well, he was a giant in the field by then.
Yes, he was the photographer for the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, and that name is kind of off-putting. His job was to document living conditions, particularly in rural America, for people during the Depression. And so he took more pictures than any other FSA photographer, and he lasted longer with that department than any other photographer.
So we may not come back to Russell Lee, and so I just want Tony to capture this only because he wrote something. He didn't write it, but this book is in memory of, so Tony, if you can just capture this, in memory of Russell Lee. This is your book.
This is my book, published by the University of Texas, and I photographed Russell Lee in that, I think it was Amarillo in 1979, at a reunion of all of the FSA photographers who were still alive. And since I couldn't get into his class for 3 years, I went over to the department and spoke with him and asked for his advice, particularly on the use of large format cameras. And then after that, I would call him up and let him know I had been to the valley and I'd photographed the farm workers, and he would always want to see the pictures, and so I would make some prints and go over. And I was told that he was fond of Scotch, so I brought him a bottle of Glenlivet, and he was happy for that.
He would have also been fond of the valley, because his photography in South Texas in agriculture was spectacular.
Oh, and the overlap. I mean, he went to Corpus Christi and was shown around by Dr. Hector Garcia, who started the American GI Forum. So it was Dr. Hector Garcia who was taking Russell Lee to the poorest parts of Corpus Christi and the west side and all of that. And then later, I was able to photograph Dr. Hector Garcia at a huge farm worker demonstration in the Capitol.
So we have actually some of that. So there's Dr. Garcia next to Antonio Rendine.
Yes, that's the demonstration.
And I'm guessing that's Moya behind Dr. Garcia.
Yes, with a bandana
Very
across
kind of like dramatic character.
Oh, right. He's got on his bell bottoms. And
right. And so we're going to get to this in more depth, I think, although it doesn't matter if we go to it now. So, Pam, if you can just keep moving a little bit, because there's some other photographs with Dr. Garcia where Dr. Garcia is kind of inconspicuous. He's trying to be, it seems, because he's not the point of it seems. but he would have lent his gravitas because he was already a major national character by this time. But we're going to see in a bit how there's much more photography that includes Dr. Garcia. But you're drawing the connection here between Russell Lee,
And
a
Dr.
mentor of yours,
Yes.
maybe the mentor of yours,
Yes.
and Dr. Garcia.
Yes. I mean, it was very good for me to know Russell Lee because there's no money in social justice photography, and there's no like career path. And I was simply doing what he had done, and of course he appreciated that greatly. There's a 3-hour oral history with Russell Lee at UT in the Benson, and they told me that I was the only photographer named. He said, Alan Pogue, he's the only one that's doing what I did. You know, the prisons and the farm workers and the brown berets, but really it was women's liberation and there's gay liberation. Everything was happening at the same moment. I mean, 1968 was so huge worldwide. I mean, that's when the students were rioting and or holding demonstrations in Paris, and then in
Mexico City
at the Olympics. I mean, it had sort of reached a critical mass, and I was as busy as I could possibly be.
Well, you were in Vietnam.
Well, I was in Vietnam. I got out in '68, yes. And I came to Austin and immediately jumped into both the anti-war movement and photographing for the RAG newspaper, which takes me back to the question you asked about how I knew about the Valley. Well, the RAG was a hub of information. Because people have to remember there's no internet. There was no Instagram, there's no Facebook. And the RAG newspaper was involved with over 180 other similar newspapers across the country. And then with the Liberation News Service, we were getting big fat packages of international news from around the world. And in the back page of the newspaper was an information guide with lists of community programs. If anybody had a problem with housing or health or anything, there's probably some little organization that was dealing with that, and we had all their phone numbers on the back page. And so information like there's going to be this big march in the Valley over farm worker rights was the kind of information that was constantly flowing through the office.
So, Alan, I want to get into the farm worker movement as an area of focus next, okay? But we're going to take a little break just to give our audience a chance to, go get some coffee or, take a little potty break or whatever, okay? So when we come back in about a minute, we're going to dive right into the farm worker movement and Alan's role in documenting, capturing through photography a good amount of that work. So stay with us. Welcome back to Museum Pláticas, a program of the Museum of South Texas History. Francisco Guajardo here with Alan Pogue. So, Alan, we've had this, I think, very interesting to me, compelling even conversation about, where you're from and your upbringing and the values that kind of shaped this social justice artist, photographer. And so we began a little bit with you being raised according to the gospel of Christ, probably, as an altar boy, the social justice part of the gospel. And then you move into being immersed in Vietnam and having a different awareness, because you did your own due diligence before you went off to Vietnam. You went to the Corpus Christi Library and you looked for books, couldn't find a lot. But it's because this is still, Vietnam is still like happening and people will write about it later. But there was a debate at the time. But it really shaped kind of a moral view that you had. And so this is shaping you. You come out of Vietnam and it's perhaps the most consequential year of the second part of the 20th century, 1968, the year that changed the war. Martin Luther King Jr. is killed. Robert Kennedy is assassinated. And the world is burning, it seems. And you come back and you become thrust in the middle of this tumult that's happening. And you happen to have your Nikon camera that you got in Japan when you were in Vietnam. And I'm guessing that you would unleash your Nikon camera right about that point. Right? And so I want to bring you then, because you told some of that story of Sister Claire being important, and then you consulting certain kinds of publications that would have, this is happening in the Valley, right? And so then you were about to get into your foray here into 1975 with the United Farm Worker strike. Which were some of the first photographs that you took of farm workers in the Valley?
Well, I had help. I mean, previous to 1975, I already knew Rebecca Flores, and and also the RAG itself. There were advocates for farm worker issues. So, if there was going to be a picket, say at Safeway, something about boycotting table grapes or head lettuce or Gallo wine, I would go photograph that. So I was aware, but I hadn't really been into the Valley, really into it. So when I got to the Valley, this march was organized by the Texas Farm Workers, and that was an offshoot of the United Farm Workers. And so I met Antonio Orondine, but most particularly Jesus Moya, because Jesus Moya was what they called a field representative. I mean, he was the guy that was going to go literally walk out into the field and talk to individual farm workers and try to get them to join the Texas Farm Workers Union and perhaps strike or boycott or picket. And so I remember some of the first pictures was the short-handled hoe. And I was directed in this by Jesus. And I went out to the field, and I could see that all of the workers had short-handled hoes. So they had a handle that was maybe a foot long or maybe 2 feet long.
This photograph that our audience has seen, Alan,
Yes.
is actually quite the contrast, because this fellow here, these two fellows are using the short handle hoe, and then there's a guy in the back using the long handle hoe.
So he can lean on it.
So he can lean on it.
Because he's the manager. He's not the worker.
Es el mayordomo. Mayordomo, like the
Yes, the major domo, the guys that sort of in charge of making sure that the work is being done.
Right.
And they would say, and kind of harshly, well, at least they're been over. I know they're doing something, which is, kind of a mean thing to say, because there's no reason for them to be bent over.
But the mayordomo kind of has the belly of a mayordomo.
Right. He hasn't getting enough exercise.
Nor could he bend over.
No, he couldn't bend over that
But
belly.
enough of those jokes, Alan. But
Right,
so,
yeah.
So this, do you have an idea of what the story is on this besides the short handle hoe and like where it would have been?
Well, I know I was always working in the Mission area, but it was up and down, different crops. Of course, onions and I thought bell peppers. Everywhere I've been, people were picking bell peppers. My joke was they must be growing on the moon. Where is a place where bell peppers can't grow?
You know, Rebecca told the story last night because you and Rebecca both presented as the first part of this food summit. And so we had a program here at the museum where we saw a documentary, and Rebecca and maybe you spoke about the short handle hoe, or maybe she said it in the movie. Can you imagine the challenges of being on the short handle hoe?
All day long bent over like that.
And the entire summer then, and then for years. You can, it makes so much sense that so many farm workers would have such physical challenges
Oh, yes.
at young ages.
And farm working is, you can look at occupations and deaths that are attributed to having that occupation, and farm workers are at the top of the list, above firemen and other industrial workers, because you got all this machinery. People can literally have their scalp ripped off if they get caught up in those conveyor belts, and they're out there in the field, they're putting crops on conveyor belts, and of course this is all mechanized, and if you get caught in the gears, it's just going to chew you up, and it does. And
So, Ellen, you kind of gave a mini master class here in the previous segment on photography, how when you were in Vietnam, you were super conscious of lighting and distance and, all those kinds of, I guess, elements of good photography. I want to ask you the question of the story, because we haven't talked about the story as you capture an image. And so I'm going to ask Pam to kind of run some images, beautiful images of children and of people studying.
oh yeah,
Like farm. But as Pam runs those here, and our audience will be able to see some of those images, speak to the idea of the story and the kind of awareness that you have as you're looking for the angle and the lighting and all of that.
yes, because you're telling a story, and so, oh golly, that was in a tomato packing shed in California. The name of the city will come to me. It's around San Diego, but it's Carlsbad, a smaller little community. And I was there photographing the English class, and this was, I call it first English lesson. I don't remember the man's name, but I think he's from Guanajuato. And he said this was the first classroom he had been in his life. And the workers were so intent on learning English that they told the teacher that they would come here on the weekends as well if the teacher would show up. And you have to think, well, this person and everyone in the room had been working all day, and they got off at 5. They only had enough time to maybe splash some water on their face and get a drink of something, and then at 5:30 they were in the classroom. And I remember I showed that photograph to Sister Adrienne Claire, and she said how she would love to have a classroom of students as intent on learning as he is.
Wait, hang on. She was able to determine that just by the photograph.
Yes, just by the angle of his face and the look in his eye. I mean, he is absolutely fixed on the English teacher, trying to absorb every little bit of information he can obtain.
If the lighting weren't on his face as it is, it wouldn't tell the same story.
No, you wouldn't be able to see his expression. So it helps that there's a dark background, and then he's being lit by the side at an angle, and that gives, it's like sculpture. It gives the face a shape. And so to give the, Nino de Polito Blanco, yeah, the child, it was the dawn, and his parents were making breakfast by cooking on a piece of sheet metal over a fire. And this child has this big chief tablet and a big pencil, and he was, I don't know if it's a boy or a girl, but it was writing the alphabet over and over, A, B, C, D to Z, and then start again with A. Practicing writing, practicing making the letters over and over. And again, this child looks up at me with this great intensity into the lens. I'll never forget it. It was a 90 millimeter lens on a Leicaflex with Tri-X film. And I always rated the film at 200 because I wanted the longest tonal range I could possibly get. And the next one, the professora, the young woman is a certified teacher in the Mexican school system. And she would come out to this encampment in the middle of nowhere, so to speak. I mean, there's nothing around it for miles, to teach these children. And so there they are underneath the palm frond roof.
Do you feel, Alan, that you have an agenda when you're taking this kind of photography?
Well, my agenda is always to show people what they probably would never have a chance to see themselves. And I want them to know when I'm taking pictures, it's a lot like being a combat medic. I mean, what you have before you is the wound. And what you want to do is fix it, close it, so the person will survive. And in order to do that, you have to put all of your emotions on hold. I mean, you just can't break out into tears and say, oh, this is awful. This guy's got his leg blown off and he's going to bleed to death instantly if I can't get a tourniquet on it. Of course it's awful, but you have a mission and you have a purpose, and it's to save this person's life. And so you have to focus intently on technique. How do you stop the bleeding? So with me as a photographer, I'm in a situation perhaps it shouldn't exist. And the people who are suffering shouldn't be suffering. Well, what's going to help them? I have to depend entirely on my interpretation of human nature, which is that people are essentially oriented to the good, that we are social beings, and what we want most above everything is for everyone to get together and get along and do their job, and everything's going to run smoothly. That's what we all want. So if I could communicate to a mass audience the essential humanity of this group of people,
such as what we're seeing there.
Oh, Hidalgo. And the wonderful thing is I was able to take those pictures that I took to that family and present them to them. And I was there because of Rebecca Flores. She said, I want you to go over to this house, this building, where 4 families live in basically 4 bedrooms. And all of these children, and they don't have any inside plumbing. There's no water running. There's no toilet inside the house. They have this structure in the backyard, and there's one cold water tap. And inside this cement cube, there's a toilet in one little part, and there's a pipe coming through the wall with no shower head where people can take a shower. And that's it. And so I guess she took me over there and left me there, and people just accepted it. Here's this guy, we don't know who he is, he's here to take our picture. And perhaps Rebecca said something to them to say, you know, what I was working for and everything.
And this would have been what year?
The date is on her T-shirt. 79 was a big year for me, a big year worldwide. So she has Head Start 1979 on her T-shirt. Marisol is her first name.
So that 1979 photograph is part of the same run that you had there with Hidalgo and the water spigot. Was it the same visit?
Yes.
So 79.
79, yes. So let's say I started in 75 with Moya, who was taking me all over the state. But in this case, I went to the UFW headquarters, and Rebecca said, I've got this place, and you've got to go there. Take these pictures. And so I spent the whole afternoon photographing the children, and children love to be photographed. They love to be paid attention to by adults under any circumstances. But I did what Russell Lee would do, because he would he always photographed whatever people put on the wall, artwork, you know, religious icons. What do people have on their dresser? You know, their intimate objects, you know, their combs and their brushes and their little bits of jewelry and other things. It's just sort of a little collection of their personal items that tell a story. And so I photographed all the walls and the kitchen. What there was of the kitchen was just a wooden table with some waterproof covering and a place for dishes to be in a basin. But there's no running water and there's no drain. There's no sink. That's all outside. And then all of the children, I got a group shot of all of them together. And so when I went back all these years later, and I brought these pictures, it was a big emotional experience because they told me these are the only pictures of our childhood.
Wow. They would not have had a camera.
I wouldn't have had a camera, and, you know, my expertise, you know, I was able to take a lot of, you know, good, clear pictures. So.
I remember you went to, when I was a high school teacher many years ago, you went to my high school. And you were working with Jaime Chain from out of what is Texas State now. It was Southwest Texas State University, and Jaime had a grant from the Kellogg Foundation. Interestingly, last night's talk was funded by the Kellogg Foundation as well. So Kellogg has done a good amount of work around here. But we took you out to Monte Alto.
Yes, the sort of a magnet middle school.
Yeah, you know, it's a little community, rural community, you know, farming community north of Elsa on Highway 88, and you went and you took at least a handful of kids. There was a kid named Cesar, and there was a kid named Martin. You remember Martin? He was 6'9".
Oh yes,
like the tallest person in South Texas.
Yes,
including the basketball team at the university.
Oh yes,
so Martin was 6'9". He was 14 years old. And you taught Martin how to take photographs. And so those photographs are here in this book that was published out of Southwest Texas State University. But this book is essentially you mentoring kids. And these were middle school kids, 8th grade kids, that would then come to the high school where I was teaching at Cauchosa. And so these kids, because they were on a multi-year plan with you, you taught them how to take photographs. And then they went out and they took photographs of living in the colonia. Yeah, and so the mission of Through Our Own Lenses was to essentially help kids understand how to document their own lives. And so this is, you know, yeah, these are some of the kids taking photographs. So, Tony, I'm not sure how you can, you know, get, yeah.
Well, so it's in people's bedrooms, in their kitchens, because I tried to impress upon the children what are the basic elements of your life. You know, you have to obtain food. The food has to be cooked. You're going to eat it somewhere. You're going to go to school. What does your house look like? What does your street look like? What does your backyard look like? What do you do for fun? Do you participate in sports? Do you go to church? What does your school look like? What does your coach look like? If you were going to tell somebody about your life, imagine they're in another planet. What would be the essential elements of your life and your friends? What do you do?
So some of these kids may not surprise you, but like Amandalina Guevara, she had like 2 or 3 cousins who lived right next door to her, one of them went to Yale University, another went to Brown.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, you remember that story. Some of these kids were,
the one that went to Brown and
like
their life.
The kid who lived in this house went to Yale, and he's now a physician, an oncologist at Doctor's Hospital at Renaissance here in McAllen. So he went to Yale, then went to medical school. Dr. Jose Cruz is his name. So these were the kids that you were working with, teaching them how to capture their lives.
Oh, yes, and it was great. And so I think I had at least 100 students, because there were students from and around El Paso, Colonia, Clint, and other places. And so I had to pick out 10 that would be able to go to Washington, D.C. and present their story to the Hispanic Caucus in these enormous, ornate buildings and rooms. But in order to do that, they had to be coached. And I'm terrible at names. But the English professor at Texas State,
Jaime Mejia
coached them and then videoed their presentation and had them watch their presentation and pointed out how they could do better, how they could work on their script until they had it memorized. So when they made their presentations before the Hispanic Caucus, they were really good and slick, and it all went very smoothly. And then we're able to show some of their photographs at the Smithsonian Museum. I mean, it was a huge experience for all these kids.
Must have been a highlight for you as well.
Oh, yes. And, I had to make all of the prints. I had to take their color negatives and flip them to grayscale so I could make black and white negatives and then prints for the book and for the presentations.
As a way to close this Plática here, Alan, what's the one story that we haven't broached this morning?
Well, I guess, as I was saying earlier, it's interesting how you pick a path and one thing leads to another. And so once I decided it was going to be social justice photography, well, then all of these groups that needed images would come to me and ask me to photograph what they were doing, what they were involved with, so that they in turn could show it to other people. So it's always thinking about, how can I explain this situation to other people who aren't there and probably will never actually be there? But the pictures have to carry the emotion as well as the actual, the physical parts always have to come together somehow to communicate the feeling. And as I said, but for me in the moment, I'm really taken up with all of the technical parts. How much light, what kind of light, the direction of the light, who are the people, and how are they moving, and are they going to move into a conjunction when all of the parts that are moving are going to hit an instant where if I take the picture right then another person can look at this picture and see all of it.
So let's end with an exhibit that I think encapsulates what you just said.
Well, there's a photograph of Cesar Chavez. He was in Austin, where he came several times, both for educational purposes and to fundraise. So he's at Johnson High School. But at that moment, he was in a hallway and he was being interviewed by a TV station. And they had one of these very hot, bright, high contrast lights on top of their TV camera. So what happens is it's almost like his face is etched with lines because the contrast is so hard, and you can see the light shining off his nose. But then the light, although it's harsh and bright, it falls off. So the background would go into almost total darkness. So when I made the print, I had to do some tricks. I wanted the dark side to be totally black, so I made it darker. But I wanted the texture of his hair to come out, so I held the light back. And then I darkened the corner, some of it, but I wanted to leave that lightness around the back of his head so that you'd get the complete sculptural effect. And, to make it some parts lighter, some parts darker. But what comes through out of all of that is the intensity of his eyes. And his face is set in a certain way. I think it sort of communicates he's moving forward, even though he's still in the photograph. He's got this energy and this piercing gaze, and he's a force. And so it sort of embodies that force that he was.
What was the last conversation you ever had with Cesar Chavez?
Oh, I remember a wonderful day. It was around the Our Lady of Guadalupe church, the big one. And we were walking along. And Cesar Chavez was an absolute encyclopedia of knowledge. And he looked at my camera, and I had a Leica rangefinder. And I don't have one on me at the moment, but it's a certain kind of camera that was popular among photojournalists, particularly in the 40s, but to this day, because the lenses are so darn good. I really didn't know how good a camera lens could be until I got a Leica rangefinder and a 28 millimeter wide angle. I said, I could blow this picture up till it's as big as the side of a barn. It's so sharp, and you could tell, you can see the detail no matter how big you make the print. And he remarked on it was a Leica. He knew about Leicas, and we discussed that. And somehow we started talking about Zen Buddhism. And so we talked about Zen Buddhism. Oh, it's because I told him I was also taking martial arts, Shotokan karate and Taekwondo and Aikido. And so we discussed martial arts and the relationship of Zen Buddhism to the samurai and martial arts. And so there wasn't anything I could mention that he wouldn't launch off and onto a lesson or expanding it further. I was extremely impressed. And he was just friendly. I mean, here we are, we're walking along in the South Texas sun, just chatting away, and
With Cesar Chavez.
with Cesar Chavez about anything under the sun. Yeah, it was wonderful.
Do you sometimes catch yourself thinking, wow, the axes I've had?
Oh, yes. Yes, the people I've met all over the world. Well, the American Friends Service Committee, which is the Quakers, asked me to go to Central America, and I went to El Salvador during the war and photographed people. And I went to Nicaragua and Guatemala. And then they asked me if I would go to the Middle East, and they sent me to Iraq. And then subsequently I went 5 times to Iraq itself and 7 times to the larger area. Went to Pakistan for a Japanese peace group. And, well, for instance, one time I went to Washington, D.C. to do research on an oral history of women in the Texas labor movement. And I had a friend who worked for Senator Frank Church. Senator Frank Church had a dark room, a full dark room, in his little suite of offices in the Senate. And he gave it over to me. So every day I would go to the Smithsonian or the National Archives, and the National Archives, they let me set up a tripod and a camera, and I copied pictures all day of workers, specifically women workers. And then I would go to his darkroom in the Senate and develop the film, so I would make sure that everything I did had turned out correctly. So I was able to develop the film the same day.
Wow.
And meet Frank Church. And learn that he was a very private individual, and he didn't like the public light. Whenever he came out in public to speak, he had to flip a switch and turn on to a different person. He wasn't naturally gregarious. He was naturally sort of a historian and scholar, who would have been happy to have spent all of his time doing research in a library. But as a politician, he had to get out with the public and be ebullient. Well, he wasn't naturally that way at all. It was so interesting.
I'm guessing you ran into some Hematenayucas there.
Yes. Oh, I went specifically to Institute of Texan Cultures in San Antonio, and they let me set up a dark room in a utility closet, and I made copies of pictures that were taken by San Antonio light photographers of just everything Hematenayuca did. And they were 4x5 negatives. These are large negatives. So I made contact prints of hundreds of them.
And you have those?
And I have those. Wow. And what I would do was there's so much detail in a 4x5 negative that I could photograph with my 35 millimeter camera pieces of these pictures and get half a dozen more pictures out of it because the detail was so fine. Hematenayuca, this young girl, 17, who was leading the pecan shellers strike and a member of the Communist Party. And so she was constantly under attack by the police and just people that didn't want any change. I mean, because the pecan shellers were being paid with bags of beans and rice. And they said, no, we want to be paid in money. We need the money. And I found a great photograph when I was looking through it. It was men holding a long banner, and it was Mexican angle, Mexican angle, Mexican angle, and the banner wrote, "The Irish and the Mexicans joined against unemployment." And it reminded me that I'm of Irish heritage, and the Irish were highly discriminated against. And so it was the union of people in the same economic condition across cultural boundaries fighting for the same purpose, employment. Simple as that.
With that story, Alan, we're going to close. I know that there's so many more stories to share, but I think that we've at least given our public and the world a little taste of the story of Alan Pogue, which has been quite extraordinary and illustrious because of your photography. So, Alan, thank you so much for coming.
I'm so happy to be here.
All right,
Glad to do it.
Good. So, friends of the Museum of South Texas History, thank you for joining us for this museum Plática. We did one yesterday with Rebecca Flores, and so hopefully some of you joined. If not, you can go to our website, our Facebook page, and you can see Rebecca Flores and from yesterday, and so then you can also see Alan Pogue's story, because as soon as this is over, that thing goes on, and so we've archived it, and it's accessible to the world. So thank you all for joining us, and so we will see you next month for the next edition of Museum Pláticas.